Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the uncompromising perspective from a libertarian standpoint of the burning issues of the day. You can find more about us at fff.org. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who is the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I thought we would discuss a topic that I don't think we've discussed in all the times we've been doing Libertarian Angle, and that's the issue of conscription, or the draft. And the reason this occurred to me is because of a pardon that Donald Trump was offering or considering giving Muhammad Ali, which was kind of amusing, not because Ali is dead, because I know they do pardon dead people sometimes, but because Muhammad Ali didn't need a pardon, that his case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. So a person who's acquitted of a criminal case doesn't need a pardon. And that's essentially what happened with Ali. But I think we ought to review the Muhammad Ali case, put it in a larger context, maybe of foreign policy, the idea of conscription, of a draft, of forcing people to serve the state and do what the state wants, go travel thousands of miles away to kill or die. I mean, this was in the midst of the Vietnam War, a war that the United States was waging against North Vietnam, against the Viet Cong, without the constitutionally required congressional declaration of war. I mean, that's our system of government. The Constitution is the higher law. It's the document that called the federal government into existence, and it set forth the powers of each branch of government. And the Constitution made it clear that Congress would have the power to declare war, the president would have the power to wage war. But this was an illegal war. So they obviously cannot get enough people to volunteer to fight in this war, which makes it a little bit suspect right there. When you got to force people to go fight in some foreign war thousands of miles away, that's a little suspicious there. But that's what the draft was. That the government assumed the power to seize people, to order people to leave their everyday lives and come into boot camp, learn how to follow orders blindly, and then be shipped thousands of miles away and be put in the position of kill or die. Muhammad Ali says no. And one of the main reasons was because of his religious convictions, and that's ultimately why the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. But I think it went much deeper than that. I think his objection to the war went much deeper, and it was a very profound objection when he said, look, no Viet Cong's ever tried to kill me. I mean, why should I go over there and try to kill them? And then he was also strongly influenced by Martin Luther King, who was raising objections to the war, to U.S. involvement in the war. And so I think it's an opportunity for us just to discuss this very notion that the government has the power to seize a citizen and force him to go thousands of miles away and do its bidding. It seems to me, Richard, this isn't really much different in principle than slavery. What do you think?
Well, I think that conscription has been referred to by a variety of people, including the famous Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, as the ultimate blood tax. It's not only that the government taxes your wealth, your income, your property, but military conscription, the draft, has the government tax your very life. It takes your life, as you said, puts you through compulsory military training, operates under a system which, as a compelled soldier in the armed forces of your nation, the political leaders of that country can then send you off and put you in harm's way, risking the safety of your own life and putting you in a situation where, to protect your own life, you have to kill others, or at least severely maim or injure others, at the bidding of your own government. This is the ultimate tyranny in many ways. Now, is this the way governments have always operated? The fact is no. Before the French Revolution in 1789, there was no notion of military conscription by governments. There were professional armies, mercenaries as you might refer to them, officers and soldiers. Sometimes a particular soldier might be sort of pressed into service. But in general, there was no military conscription. This emerged with the French Revolution. Having done away with the king, the French Revolutionists said that the ultimate authority is the people, the nation, and that now every individual owes their life, their property, their everything to serve the people, because as one of the people, to do so is merely to protect and act on behalf of themselves. And so in the name of defending the French Revolution, for the first time in certainly modern history, the French Revolutionists imposed a military conscription, declaring that everyone in principle, either sex, any age, was subject to compulsory military service because you were serving the nation and the people as a whole, not the arbitrary will of a king. Now, once that got hold of thinking, this began to spread. The next major country that did this in the 19th century was Prussia. Having been badly defeated by Napoleon's army, Frederick, of the King of Prussia, decided to implement military conscription. He was going to see that Prussia was going to be strong enough to never be humiliated as the French had humiliated his nation. And then that became the basis of Germany, first Prussia and then Germany having military conscription. Then the British resisted this. The French pretty much resisted this after the French Revolution for the most part. But then the First World War came. And now governments needed millions upon millions of ordinary citizens to serve in the military, to use a phrase, to be cannon fodder for the battles. And whether it be Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Imperial Russia, and then finally the United States, once Woodrow Wilson had brought the U.S. into the First World War with a declaration of war in April of 1917, military conscription was introduced into the United States. Now, we had had it once before, and that was under Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War, since he could not get enough volunteers to join the Northern cause in fighting the Southern states. But really, the watershed was the First World War, where compulsory military service became virtually universal among all the major countries of Europe and then North America. And that became the idea that the government owns you, that can take your body and your soul and put you on a battlefield and cause your death based upon what they have declared to be a just, good, necessary, or reasonable war. It certainly was the case in the Second World War and then the Korean War and then the Vietnam War. It is the ultimate denial of liberty, where you take a person, put them in a deadly situation, and force them to kill to avoid being killed. In this context, maybe some of the viewers and listeners have never heard of it, but the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, Leonard E. Read, was an individual of great principle and integrity, willing to go against the currents of views. And during the Korean War, I believe it was in 1951 or 52, he published a little monograph called Conscience on the Battlefield. And the imagery is of an American soldier who is dying on the battlefield in Korea, having been put in the situation of fighting the North Koreans and the Chinese. And he's now, as his life is draining away, asking, why am I here? Why have I been put in this situation? Why have I been forced to kill? And why am I now faced with losing my life to serve the interests of the government? The idea of a free society, Jacob, if I can continue with this a moment, is that in a free society, if your country is really threatened by a foreign foe, in which the life, liberty, and property of the citizenry are under attack, then a free people should have the willingness and the courage and the integrity to come to their own properties and life defense and their families, and those of their fellow countrymen. A draft implies that the government has not persuaded the people that this is a just cause, and that they therefore must compel people to serve under the banner when they have not been able to show to the citizenry that this is a military threat that deserves them willing to leave their homes and their families and risk their life, or at least the injury of themselves, to preserve their freedom. A draft is a demonstration of the failure of their own government to persuade the citizenry of a just cause. And that makes it even more of an unjust and immoral act.
Yeah, it's so appalling to me because it really is a question of master versus servant, of who is the master and who is the servant. And in a free society, it is the citizens who are the masters, and it is government that is the servant. And that was the whole idea of using the Constitution to call into existence the federal government. That the idea is that it is we, the people, who are calling this institution into existence to serve as a servant, not to become our master. I mean, that was very clear when they came out of the Constitutional Convention with this proposal to call the federal government into existence. But somehow or another, that relationship has been inverted, where the citizen is the servant. It must comply with these commands of the federal government. Now, people might say, oh, well, Jacob, this is all esoteric, ivory tower, pie in the sky, because there really is no draft right now. We have a volunteer army. Well, that's not exactly the case. We have the first stage in conscription, and that's draft registration. Every guy that reaches 18 years of age is required to go down and register his name, which means he's the servant. He's going to the government saying, here is my name, here's where you can find me. Whenever you need me, then I'm here to serve you and obey your commands. That places government in the position of master. It puts the citizen in the position of servant. In a genuinely free society, the government would have no authority to force anybody to go fight in any war, even a purely defensive war. If somebody says, hey, look, I'm scared, I don't want to go fight, I'll let you guys do the fighting. Well, so that's the price of freedom, where people have choices to make. My hunch is that most Americans would come to the defense of their country if the country was ever invaded, but certainly there'd be some that say, no, it's not for me. That right has to be protected. Otherwise, you end up destroying freedom with conscription when you're supposed to be trying to protect freedom. You're bringing up World War I is absolutely excellent. I mean, here was a case where it was clear the United States had not been invaded. There was no threat of a German takeover of the United States. This was classic just social engineering on an international scale, where President Wilson says, you know what, Europe's been besieged by wars through all the centuries. If the U.S. gets involved in this thing, we can make war end forever. This will be the war to end all wars. We're going to make the world safe for democracy with U.S. interventionism. Well, as you point out, clearly he couldn't persuade Americans to go over there and give their lives for this noble cause, so he had to force them. He had to conscript them. He had to draft them to go over there, and I forget the numbers that were killed. They were certainly in the tens of thousands. For what? I mean, what did World War I accomplish except maybe give the conditions that gave rise to Hitler and the Nazi Party? And that was one of the main reasons why Americans were so ardently and overwhelmingly opposed to getting involved in World War II, because they had seen what had happened in World War I, where all these men, part volunteers, part conscripts, had died for nothing. So yeah, I think it's a matter of freedom, and then it's just a matter of utility, that you just don't force people to go fight in these ridiculous foreign wars.
Yes, once you impose a military draft, you not only create a rift in the society, because some, at the government's prerogative, whether it be an age category, or as was done during the Vietnam War, a lottery. My number was 127, if I remember correctly. And my number came up, and I was not excited or enthusiastic about being conscripted into the Army and being sent to Vietnam. Basically because I did not consider it to be a just war that involved the protection of the life, liberty, and property of American citizens. I was already a classical liberal libertarian at that time. I chose, as a personal decision, not to go to Canada and admittedly not go to jail. I joined the Naval Reserves as the lesser of the evil, and I served my active duty in the Naval Reserves. Stateside. Now, that was my choice, but I was put in a position of having to choose the lesser of the evils of having to serve in the U.S. military in some capacity for a certain period of time, when that was not my free decision or desire, and for that portion of my life to be taken out of my hands. Yes, I chose an avenue that did not put me into physical harm's way, like unfortunately some of my high school friends who did go to Vietnam, and some came back in body bags. But nonetheless, even if it is a peacetime conscription, where you're not in harm's way, and like I said, my active duty was in San Diego, California, for that period of time, my life has been taken away from me. Am I choosing to continue with my education as a young person? Am I choosing to try to get a job and begin a financial path to the goals and purposes I have, looking to the years and decades ahead? No. I had to serve the United States government in this capacity under military commanding and structures of obedience under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And therefore, I was an indentured servant, if you will. I chose an indentured servitude less threatening to myself than if I had been drafted into the Army and sent to Vietnam. But the fact is, I was nonetheless an indentured servant. That is a denial of liberty and a denial of freedom. And this view, which may seem shocking to some conservatives or maybe even some libertarians today, you could go down the list. Milton Friedman would write in his old Newsweek column against the military draft. Ayn Rand, the individualist philosopher of her philosophy of objectivism, vehemently was against the military draft. Murray Rothbard, the well-known libertarian economist, vehemently spoke out against the draft. I should also mention that in 1946, Russell Kirk, the well-known conservative philosopher of the 1950s and 60s, he served in the First World War, and shortly after he returned in 1946, he wrote an article, even as a conservative rather than a libertarian, vehemently speaking out against conscription as a form of slavery. So all friends of freedom, certainly classical liberals, libertarians, individualist objectivists, and even a conservative like Russell Kirk, viewed this as the ultimate denial of the principles upon which the country had been founded.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at slavery in the Old South, I think everybody understands what that meant. It meant that a black person had to work on the plantation. He had no choice. If he tried to escape, they would whip him and in extreme cases kill him. That this was the essence of slavery, that a person is denied the right to go out and just make his own life on his own.
Right.
Well, suppose you had said to a slave, okay, well, we're going to let you have 1/4 of your day free. You can go out and start, you work in the private sector, do whatever you want during that 1/4 of the day, but the other 3/4, you're going to be here on this plantation or else. Well, I think everybody would still recognize that as slavery. I mean, even though you're letting them have 1/4 of the day off, it's still slavery. Well, the draft is really no difference from that. I mean, they're taking the guy out of the private sector. They're saying, well, as soon as the war is over, we'll let you go back. But during this period of time, you will serve us. We will feed you. We will take care of you. We will train you. But you will obey our orders. You will go and kill or die. You will do whatever we tell you to do. And I don't see that that's any different from slavery at all. And I think part of the problem here is that, inevitably, when the big crisis starts, like a big war, that's when all of a sudden people are going to see the real effects of this. And I don't think that it's only going to be men. I think there's a good possibility they're going to be drafting women too under all this equal rights stuff.
Yes.
And I think every parent should be taking that into consideration. Now, the thing about being young is that you think you can't die, that you're going to live forever, and that war seems esoteric, that you'll be one of the ones that'll make it through. But older people are wiser than that. And I think it's incumbent, and what we're doing right now is raising the consciousness of older people, and when there is no massive emergency and no crisis, because when that day comes, reason and sound thinking are going to be in very short supply. It's now that the parent that has children coming up 16, 17 years old, 15 years old, needs to be thinking about this, that this is not a good way of life for your child, and that it's incumbent on those of us that know better to be raising people's vision to what the right thing is, and that's no registration, no conscription, and of course no foreign wars either. Now, inevitably, Richard, we get the attacks like we did after the 9/11 stuff when we were raising objections to invading Iraq and invading Afghanistan, and we were showing how the 9/11 attacks were blowback from U.S. interventionist foreign policy, and we get the standard attacks. You hate America, you're a traitor, you don't love the government, you are against the CIA and the NSA and the Pentagon and all this sort of nonsense. But if you look back at the 19th century, I mean, there was no draft registration except during the Civil War, and as you pointed out, there was massive protests because people were saying this violates the principles of liberty in which our country was founded. But there's that great piece that I recommend everybody to read by Daniel Webster. Now, I don't think anybody's going to accuse Daniel Webster of hating America, and but he's got this fantastic piece. I think it's called On Conscription. You can find it online, and Webster goes in there and explains in a very eloquent and passionate way why conscription violates not only the principles of liberty, but the principles of America.
Exactly. The other element that the military draft does is that if the cause for which part of the citizenry is being compelled into military service is a cause that divides the American people, it intensifies the rift within the country itself. When Abraham Lincoln introduced military conscription in 1863, because he was having a difficult time getting enough volunteers to bolster the Union Army, it resulted in draft riots in New York, in which, if I remember the number, something like 500 people were killed. I could be wrong about the number, but it was a sizable number. And in the Vietnam War, which was literally 100 years after the American Civil War, you saw the same divisiveness, that it wasn't just that some Americans were saying, is this a legitimate military intervention by the United States? Is it in America's interest? Is it a just war? The intensity of the opposition was reinforced because young men were being compelled to serve in the military and sent over to fight a war that they either opposed or didn't understand. And that meant that young people, parents, protested, resisted, got into scuffles with the police. In some instances, campus riots resulted in the use of live ammunition with young people killed. It was on the cover of Time and Newsweek magazine when these episodes happened. All of which emphasizes that a military draft not only is unjust in its individual effect on the person affected, but further tears the society apart, because you're compelling people to serve in causes they do not believe in or do not understand, and that arouses the anger and the resistance of both those young people and their parents, and polarizes the society even more than that particular conflict necessarily would, even if it was with a volunteer army.
Yeah, and you know, if we return back to Muhammad Ali, I mean, he made a very astute point. I mean, he was sort of mirroring what Martin Luther King had said. He says, "Here you're sending me by force thousands of miles away, supposedly to fight for freedom, while over here, how are blacks free when we're living under segregation?"
Right.
You know, a little disconnect here. And then I think his point was so well taken when he says, "Look, the Viet Cong haven't attacked me. Why should I go over there and kill them?" And, well, the answer was because we're ordering you to do so. Now, look, Richard, if the U.S. government had not gotten involved in the Vietnam War, it was purely a civil war, how many Americans would have voluntarily gone over there and helped the South to maintain its independence? Now, that's what we often argue, that, hey, look, even though the U.S. government should not get involved in these foreign conflicts, private Americans should be free to go and offer their services. And as you pointed out in a previous show, they did that during the Spanish Civil War. Now, how many Americans would have gone to Vietnam and given their lives for the sake of keeping the South essentially seceded from the North? And my hunch is none. That nobody would have done that. Not even the troops, any of the troops, regular army, volunteers, or whatever, would have said, you know what, this is a cause important for me to go fight. And even if I'm wrong, I can't imagine it'd be more than 5 or 10 people. But the government makes this decision and says, well, we believe it's important, so we're going to send this massive standing army that we have, and we're going to, that's not enough, so we're going to have to conscript people, we're going to have to force people to go over there. So people like Muhammad Ali, and he was just one of many, said, no, we're not going to go. Now, people might say, oh, well, Jacob, there's the conscientious resistor provision where people can say, well, you know, I have a conscientious objection, I'm a conscientious objector, and therefore I shouldn't have to go. But what a lot of people don't realize is that that's a very limited exception. That is, that you have to be a conscientious objector and prove it to all war. You have to essentially be a pacifist. That you can't say, well, I object to this particular war. Well, my question is, why not? If this particular war violates a person's conscience, even though he may believe in defensive wars, why shouldn't he be relieved of any obligation of killing people in a war that he believes in his conscience is immoral?
Right. I mean, what would be the attitude of most Americans if they were to hear a story such as a German in the 1930s and 40s were to say, I love my country, and if Germany really was invaded or threatened by a neighboring nation, I would feel called to help defend it from such a foreign aggressor. But Adolf Hitler is fighting aggressive wars or threatening aggressive wars. Racist ideology, and I, as a German, refuse to serve under such a banner. I'm not against war in general, in terms of defending my country properly, but I'm against the current government's aggressive wars, and therefore I refuse to serve. Would an American consider that German a hero or a traitor? Properly, we would say that that was a person of great courage and integrity, because he would have been imprisoned and maybe killed by the Nazis. And therefore, we would tip our hat to such a person under such a threatened regime. And that's basically saying that you have to ask yourself, is this a good cause or a good war, or is it not? And there are political philosophers who have written books about what are just and unjust wars. Does that not mean that some wars could be justified as necessary or essential to the preservation of your own country's freedom and this freedom of the citizenry versus an unjust war? And if one philosophically sees the basis of such distinctions, is it not therefore a implication of that a person as a free citizen should be able to ask himself, is this a just war or an unjust war which my government is asking me to fight? If it is just, as a threat to my family, my home, my country, the freedom of myself and others in my country, I may be compelled within myself to be willing to risk life and limb to go fight. But I should be able to say that if it's an unjust war, I should not be compelled to serve it.
Yeah, your example of Nazi Germany, I think, is great. That because they had conscription there. Now, nobody would argue that Nazi Germany is a free country,
Right.
but part of this lack of freedom was the idea that you will serve when we order you to serve, and we're now at war, and now the citizens become our servants, and we will conscript you and draft you and make you serve in the military. And then you've got the famous story, my favorite story of resistance to tyranny and wrongful wars is the White Rose, the group of students at the University of Munich that started publishing pamphlets saying, don't support the troops. This was in the middle of World War II. They're saying, don't support the troops and rise up and oust this regime, oppose this regime. And, of course, they got caught and tried within 3 days and beheaded. And it's fascinating how the judge treated them at their so-called trial, where he said, you all are bad Germans. You should be supporting the government here in time of crisis. That is the job of a citizen. And Sophie Scholl, one of the brothers, sisters that was principals in the White Rose, said, oh no, that is not the job of the citizen. It is our job to make a stand against your wrongdoing. And if people haven't seen the movie Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, I highly recommend it.
Yes.
Well, Richard, on that note, we're out of time, so we'll wrap it up. It's always good to see you and to share and discuss these ideas with you and with our viewers and listeners.
Yes, and I just want to, as I always try to do, to thank our viewers and listeners to sharing a little bit of their time to hear about the ideas of liberty as we try to articulate them. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your great support. Thanks for your comments and your feedback on this show. We were very appreciative. And Richard, until next time.
Until next time.